RedLAC and CAFÉ and our other partners, financial and technical, released an update to the practice standards for conservation trust funds. It's called Practice Standards 2020. And we're very honored to have one of the authors of the practice standards here, Amilcar Guzman, who will be sharing with us some sort of general observations from the update to the practice standards. And then we're going to have a small panel after that with 3 people. María Luisa Hernandez from RedLAC, Sylvie Goyer from the Prince Albert II Trust of Monaco, Foundation of Monaco, and Antoine Willems from Profanampe. So without further ado, knowing that we're running a little late, I'm passing to Amilcar. Hopefully we're online. Okay, great.
Okay. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, okay. And how can I pass the slides? This work? Yeah, now it's working. I think this was introduced already, so I will just go to my presentation. So, well, I'm Amilcar Guzman. I'm part of Wolf's company, and I was one of the, well, part of this big team of people who updated the practice standards for conservation trust funds last year. The other co-authors were Viviana Luján, who was also part of Wolf's company, and Paquita Bath, who's from Aligning Visions. So we also had a work with a big task force of, well, around 25 different organizations. Yes. Oh, yeah. And of course, very closely with the Conservation Finance Alliance to do this. So I don't know how many of you here work for CTFs. If you can raise your hands, okay, just a few. And how many of the other participants are familiar with a conservation trust fund is? Okay, and who isn't familiar with what a conservation trust fund is? Okay, okay. So maybe it's good to start with some definition, because, well, conservation trust funds are organizations that are dedicated to mobilize resources towards nature conservation projects. They do it in the form of grants. They manage funds and capital and invest them to generate returns that they can then allocate to conservation projects, right? And the first conservation trust funds were created around 30 years ago. So it's a community that's becoming just very new for some people, but it's actually not so new in general. And in 2014, also in a collective effort, the practice standards for conservation trust funds were developed. So what we did last year was really an update of those practice standards, which is just a set of voluntary tools and guidance for conservation trust funds to, well, it can be used in different stages, right? And in design, management, or in evaluation of conservation trust funds. And one of the advantages as well is that it's not only to guide conservation trust funds, but it's also important for donors, because they can harmonize their efforts by following the standards, because conservation trust funds usually gather many donors and have work with many donors and partners. And sometimes the donors have very specific requirements, and sometimes they are all different from each other. So having these standards is really an advantage in that sense, because it can really minimize transaction costs. Yes, so the purpose of the 2020 update was to continue raising the bar. So the 2014 version of the practice standards was widely used. In parallel to this project, we also conducted a study, and we applied a global survey, and we learned that around 75% of the conservation trust funds used the practice standards already, the 2014 practice standards. And so as a very popular and widely used tool, the idea was to maintain the spirit of the previous version, right? So we maintained the organizing principle. The idea was to make some small edits. There were some things that were emerging as necessary for conservation trust funds. And I will just show a few of them in this presentation, just for you to learn what the new additions are. So this is what we have on the screen. So we follow the same principles. There are some sections that have detailed standards, so the detailed descriptions of the standards, and those sections are organized by having a description, the evidence that conservation trust funds can use to monitor progress and to see if they are really following the standards or not. We edited some standards that needed some rewording and added some new standards that were really important according to donors and conservation trust funds themselves. Then another addition was that there were some new themes that were becoming very important for conservation trust funds. And those were also incorporated in some cases as cross-cutting themes because they are important in different areas. So as I just mentioned, we did this in parallel with another study, the 10-year review of conservation trust funds, which was intended as an update of some previous reviews that were conducted in the past, another one around 2010, 11, and the previous one in 1998. So we looked at the current roles of conservation trust funds, what was the evolution over the last 10 years, what were the emerging trends, and many of these aspects are also reflected in the new version of the practice standards. So it was a really great advantage and opportunity to do these two studies in parallel and with the same team and the same task force. So those are some of the emerging trends that we captured in the practice standards. And of course, we had to align the vocabulary. There were some specific terms that I think that's way too specific for this session, but you can see it, of course, if you're interested in using the practice standards. So what is new? There is a new core area on risk management and safeguards. There is some regrouping. There used to be a core area of standards focusing on operations. And now that's divided into institutional effectiveness and programs. So institutional effectiveness focuses really on the institution of the Conservation Trust Fund as an institution and how to make their operations more effective, whereas programs focuses much more on grant making, which is what's the core mission of most conservation trust funds. Then there are these cross-cutting teams that were partly reflected in the previous version of the practice standards, but were not explicitly addressed. Now they are clearly identified and explained. And finally, we also make some distinctions among different stages of the life cycle of CTFs, which is very important because not all the standards are applicable to every conservation trust fund. So there are some very young conservation trust fund in a very early stage that might not really cover every aspect, and that's not a reason for them to feel really frustrated because it's really what's only applicable to their stage of development. So we made that very clear in this version as well. And finally, we added some specific tools to make their use much more practical. This is how the practice standards look. So these are the 7 core areas. And there were most of the changes were in these 3 areas that I have highlighted there. So the split between institutional effectiveness and programs, and then the addition of risk management and safeguards. There are 19 new standards. And we added these 4 cross-cutting themes. So this really summarizes what I was explaining before. Well, here we have some of the updates. I'm not going to read this in detail or tell you too many things. You can have a look at some of the additions. But maybe a couple of things about adding this new section. This is something that has emerged as a need for many conservation trust funds as they have been pursuing accreditation with international agencies. So let's say with GEF or with the Green Climate Fund, they have many requirements that are reflected that touch upon this subject in particular. And building on these lessons learned from some advanced conservation trust funds, we could compile a list of 7 standards. So that's in risk management and safeguards. Then in terms of communications, that's also an important aspect that was highlighted by donors and conservation trust funds, a network of conservation trust funds as well, in relation to communicating the value of conservation trust funds to donors or potential partners. That's very important. It's very instrumental in order to achieve successful partnerships or mobilize resources as well. So here we added a few additional components. Then as conservation trust funds have continued to evolve, some of them have become quite big. They have become quite institutionalized and also have a growing staff basis, right? And then they have also, there are many lessons learned in relation to human resource management and what's specifically relevant for conservation trust funds. So that's also captured there. And finally, in terms of technology, that was another cross-cutting area. This maybe something that's important to mention here is that the practice standards are not supposed to give recommendation on specific things to adopt or changes to make, but to guide the process that CTFs might need to follow in some specific areas, right? So the practice standards are not recommending specific types of technology, but procedures or processes that are important for conservation trust funds to decide themselves on what's better in their specific context. So that's what this theme covers really. And this is also cross-cutting, so it covers, it goes along different areas, different core areas. Now, just to make it more practical, we also added some tools, as I mentioned. These are the different stages of conservation trust funds that we identified. So it goes from the pre-registration. So when there is a concept and then there is an idea of establishing a conservation trust fund, to really determination. In some cases, conservation trust funds have because of their the documents that created the trust fund, they have some conditions that might terminate it at a certain moment, or in some cases, because of different conditions, they might have to stop their operations, and we go until that. But this might not be applicable to all conservation trust funds, of course. So what we have in that annex is a list of all the standards, and then each conservation trust fund can check what's applicable to them. Then another annex is provide some tools that have been developed by some conservation trust funds themselves to evaluate what their progress has been. So what's their level of achievement? And this is very useful for them to communicate with donors as well. So to show, okay, we cover 70% of the practice standards, we cover 100% of the practice standards that apply to us, etc. So there is a compilation of different tools that can be used for that purpose. And then, of course, the cross-cutting themes, they are also clearly distinguished here. So, for example, if we look at monitoring and evaluation, then we know that that's important for all these different core areas, and the standards are presented there. And then the last tool that we integrated was, well, of course, a comparison between the previous version and the current version, to make it easier for conservation trust funds to monitor their progress and to continue with previous efforts, because many conservation trust funds assessed their operations based on the previous standards, and now they will have to do it based on this new version. So it's very important to have that distinction very clear, to have a clear attribution of the different standards. So hopefully with all these updates, the standards continue to support conservation trust funds in their mission. So these are some of the key things that we extracted from the review as well. The importance that conservation trust funds have had in helping their respective countries in the achievement of SDGs or other international targets, climate goals and targets, agreements, etc. The role that conservation trust funds play, linking these global priorities to local action and bringing global resources that are made available internationally to local projects or national projects, and then create real impact on the ground. And another one, of course, is to accelerate the use of new financial mechanisms, because complying with the practice standards and following all these recommendations can also help build trust, can help strengthen operations, strengthen the Conservation Trust Fund as an institution. And that, of course, has impacts on what a Conservation Trust Fund can do and what kind of mechanisms can actually implement. So some Conservation Trust Funds are working on more complex, especially the ones who are very well institutionalized, working on more and more complex finance mechanisms. And finally, of course, help cover the biodiversity funding gap, which is still pretty big, and even probably bigger now with the new targets and goals for the creation of new protected areas and so on. So, well, thanks to our donors. This was a very collective effort, supported by many donors and also by a big task force. So this was all our task force of different international organizations. Well, thank you. So that's the overview.
Excellent. Amilcar, thank you very much. I don't know if you want to participate in the panel or if we should just maybe open the floor to a few questions. Yeah. Okay. So maybe just see if there's any questions on Amilcar's presentation and about the practice standards. You can, by the way, you can download them on the CAFÉ website, conservationfinancealliance.org, and along with the 10-year review that CTFs 2020, which we have a session on Monday at 11 in the morning, and it'll be right here. So don't miss that one. That's going to be good as well. Okay. No questions. It was so clear. It's brilliant. It's a really great document, very, very clearly written, great pictures. Highly recommend you download it. And yes, question.
Yeah, my question. Sorry, I didn't follow the whole presentation.
Okay, so the question is about park rangers and if there are standards on rights, human rights in park. Maybe you could talk about the social and environmental safeguards.
Yes, so there are some standards, I think, especially in the core area, the new core area on risk management and safeguards. And well, there are detailed descriptions of the standards, and then in those detailed descriptions, these specific topics are mentioned as, for example, recommended, depending on the context of the specific conservation trust fund. So if it's something relevant in their context, in their country, etc. So there are some topics. I can't remember exactly if there is something on human rights of park rangers, but there we refer to gender mainstreaming and well, so there's something about human rights. I don't know if it's specific about park rangers in that case, but those were topics that were obtained from all the interviews and exchange with conservation trust funds as relevant for their operations. But in that core area, of course, there is something that would be the core area to look at for those standards. Mm-hmm.
And I'll just add that the CFA has a task force on environmental and social safeguards, and they're working on a set of documentation for helping smaller conservation trust funds, all conservation trust funds, establish their environmental and social safeguards. Because what happens is the trust funds give out grants to organizations, say a park agency, and we have to encourage them to put in place the safeguards. And so it's a funder relationship, and so it's quite complicated. But we're working on that both at the task force and through the standards here. So yeah. Yes, donors are involved in that. Yeah, yeah. So great. Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on to the panel here. We have three great panelists who have been involved in conservation trust funds for a long time. Maybe I'm going to pass you a microphone if that works. And you could just start off by just giving a quick introduction on who you are and what you've been doing with conservation trust funds, and start off with Sylvie.
Great, happy to start. My name is Sylvie Goyer. I've been involved with Conservation Trust Fund from the early 2000s and first through the CAFÉ. And then when I started setting up the back home app, the Mauritanian Conservation Trust Fund. Since then, I've been involved with various trust funds and with the CAFÉ network, and still engaged with the CFA. I'm on the executive committee of the CFA. And on the other hand, I serve the Prince Albert II of Monaco Foundation. I've joined the foundation just a year ago. That's it.
Hello, everyone. I'm Luisa Hernandez, and I haven't been for such a long time in this subject, also because I'm a bit younger, but I've been I've been working for 3 years with the Forever Costa Rica Association, which is a conservation trust fund. And I also manage the RedLAC network, which is the Latin American and Caribbean network of environmental funds. And I would just like to say that Amilcar's introduction of what a CTF is was very beneficial, but I just wanted to add that we also have the networks of conservation trust funds. So this is where most of our work with CFA comes in. We have RedLAC, and we also have CAFÉ, which is the network of conservation trust funds from Africa. We also have APNET from Asia Pacific. So these are spaces for collaborative work and education, and like South-South cooperation and the development of communities of practice. So just.
Good afternoon with everyone. My name is Anton Willems. I am the executive director of Profonampe. Profonampe was one of the first conservation trust funds established in Latin America. Actually, I think it's the second one. I joined Profonampe in 2019, and I have been overseeing the complete restructuring of the trust fund, following all these standards, because as Amilcar mentioned, one of the demands of the international donors is that you follow standards. And since Profonampe is accredited at GCF and Adaptation Fund, we need to have the highest compliance of these standards. So glad to be here.
Well, glad to have you here. Great. So a couple questions. I mean, maybe we'll start with you, Anton. The practice standards set sort of a relatively high level of ambition for achieving them. I know that conservation trust funds work for years in a way to get to those standards. So how do you use the standards to sort of evaluate your operations and your process, and how does it lead to continuous improvement, and how are they useful that way?
Yes, but what we have been seeing in these last 2 years is that following standards is kind of how do you say in Spanish, is a circle of continuous improvement. So you have to apply, then monitor, observe, and retroalimentate. Yeah, feedback your own rules. No, and in our case, we also did this with an external organization who helped us, guiding us with the procedure. So defining the new organizational chart, having a lot of new functions appearing on this organizational chart is something that you receive when you have this kind of feedback from third parties. And I think that's also one of the good things of being in RedLAC, for instance. We have these communities of practice, and not only with RedLAC, but also with GCF and Adaptation Fund. So you learn from each other, you see what the other trust funds are doing good, And one way of seeing if they are doing good is if they can access new donors or more requiring donors. So as Profonampe, we are a trust fund who always look very high. You know, we search for excellence. And I think that's a difficult task because implementing all these standards, it's not easy. It's not cheap. No, for instance, the running cost of the organizations start to increase as in a way once you start applying more and more standards. No? For instance, we are now introducing. We have recently hired our integrity and compliance officer, and that's a position that not all trust funds can implement because it's someone who directly work with the board. It doesn't work with the organization below, so they supervise the way the executive director and the whole team is implementing the procedures. So finally, I think it's very demanding, and at the same time, it's like. You have a good feeling once you start to comply with what having the checks on the dots. No, so it's very difficult procedure.
Right. So interesting. So you so it's a challenge to go, but it's nice to have a vision of where to go. And it's interesting because they are challenging, and the larger conservation trust funds have more budget for operations and for internal. So it's really challenging for the smaller trust funds to do. Maybe going to pass to Maria Luisa. So RedLAC is a network of conservation trust funds. How do you support each other, and do the standards come into play? And how have you been sharing lessons learned? And like to hear.
So maybe one of the first things that we tried to get involved with was, of course, getting in touch with CFA. We are hosting a series of webinars, monthly webinars, going through each one of the standards. And then for each standard, we have a presentation by one of the writers. And then we immediately after have case studies. So we have a case study from CTF around the world, sometimes RedLAC, sometimes CAFÉ members, sometimes from other parts of the world. And this gives the opportunity to see how these standards are actually happening. How are they being implemented? So this is one of the ways that we've done it. And now in the future, we're hoping to also create CAFÉ conservation trust funds to find ways in which they can self-evaluate. And also we're thinking about the possibility of having a peer evaluation between the funds. So this is something that will be presented actually tomorrow at 11 o'clock right here. It's related to the Bridge project, which is a project that we're going to be implementing both CAFÉ and RedLAC for the benefit of our members, for them to find new ways to engage with the private sector, diversify their funding sources. And part of this is also ensuring that there is quality in the processes so that we are actually able to reach those new donors, new financial mechanisms. So the practice standards are definitely a tool for that. And to the future, we're trying to find ways, additional ways in which we can implement them and collaborate so that these standards can be actually done by the funds, even if it's a little bit expensive. We're trying to find a way so that the funds not necessarily have to hire a consultant or hire a company to assess this, but that they are able to do it in-house, or that they can find peers even from Africa. Latin American funds can go to peers in Africa and have them assess them, and then make an exchange in that sense as well.
So just a follow-up question. I mean, you know, for the most part, these standards are used as an internal tool to self-evaluate, but you're now talking about having some external evaluation. Do you see there's an opportunity at some point to sort of standardize that external evaluation? Is there a value for a third-party evaluator, like in a more formal setting? Is that something useful? Or
Yes, I think more what we're looking at is some funds have done their self-evaluation. So for example, Forever Costa Rica did their self-evaluation. They hired a consultant, and the consultant came in and said, okay, you're complying with these standards. And we do think that having a tool, like a unique tool that will be used by all members, will be very useful, but not necessarily having it be done by a third party. But just thinking that that third party doesn't have to be someone you hire, but rather an exchange. And there is where I think the value of it comes. Mm-hmm.
Great, excellent. Well, let me move to Sylvie here. Maybe ask you broaden out the questions a bit. You've had experience from helping set up trust funds and supporting the standards the first time through, right? And now you're kind of looking at it from a donor point of view to a certain extent. So can you just kind of share with us your thoughts of the value of these standards overall in the sort of ecosystem of conservation trust funds?
Thanks, David. Yeah, let me just mention when we started the practice standards, so that we started the process in 2012 or so. The objective, conservation trust funds were very diverse animals and coming in all shape and forms, and which is fine. But we had the feeling that there was a need to document the practices. And I think that's what the first standards were about, to document the practices. I remember we had quite a discussion on the name. I mean, should we call that standards, guidelines? And we came up with a compromise to practice standards, just to say that we focus on the practice, because the practice, each conservation trust fund has its own context and donors and regulations they have to adhere to and all that. So we wanted to focus on practice, yet we felt already, and I see that it's coming even stronger now, we felt that there was a need for some benchmarking, I mean, across the conservation trust funds. Also, David, because a lot of donors were coming to us, and as you know, big donors, they want to do due diligence, they want to do all those things, and it's costly sometimes for them to do so, and it's they don't know where to start with the conservation trust fund. So we thought we're going to help them. If we have some kind of standards across, at least they have a blueprint to say, well, look, how do you measure against those? So that was the initial idea. I'm extremely impressed with the work you have done and how this has evolved, because now we have very solid guidelines, I should say, voluntary guidelines, but you use the term. You have added very significant sections. I like the life cycle, because this is something that's very critical as well, as you pointed out. It's all different lives in a conservation trust fund. You've added the safeguards, which for the GCF or the GEF are critical, and for a lot of the donors are critical. So there's been great improvement, and you mentioned 75%, having reference the practice standard. So this is quite an achievement. So from my perspective, I see now that, again, please bear in mind, I mean, conservation trust fund, I mean, we mostly hear conservationists, but so it's the C, we kind of knew pretty well how to go about it, what conservation is about. It's the TF that was a bit shaky for a lot of us. I mean, gee, we were faced with investment partners, and, we have a hard time investing our own money, so let alone, a trusted investment. So the practice standards, I think, and all the work that's been doing with the webinars are helping a lot in all this area, which is really financial management. CTFs is a financial institution. Now what I see now with the great progress that's been made, and really congratulations to all of the parties involved in it, is conservation trust funds are a lot more professional now. I mean, they are up in the school with the big institutions. They access the GCF, they're accredited to a lot of, and they access big funding. They've proved now that they are able to really reach out to a lot of the funders and instill, credibility, which is what the purpose was. I think also with the standards and with the practice standards, we've demonstrated this collective, and you've talked about that, the collective, and you've mentioned RedLAC. It's this collective undertaking. I mean, it's remarkable, this community of practice of the CTF. And that's what's helping everyone grow. And Prof. Nampe, you've mentioned that as well. You're all kind of trying to do better. There is this kind of emulsion, you know, just like stirring up a pot, and everybody's trying to do better, but in a good spirit. So I think the practice standards have helped that as well, really grow in efficiency and effectiveness. And finally, I think you're hearing all through the Congress, everybody's looking for innovative funding. I mean, innovative finance. I mean, green bonds are coming now big, and a lot of blended finance is getting big. And we see trust funds positioning themselves because of all this experience. You're positioning, your great convening agent to position yourself to capture and implement some of these great new financing tools. So I'm a bit biased because I'm fully behind conservation trust funds, of course, and David knows that, but I'm very encouraged, and I want to congratulate on the great achievements of this new edition. Thank you.
Thank you. No, that was great. Thank you, Sylvie. Appreciate it. Let me maybe go back to Anton. Yeah. So you're, yeah, I mean, so the trust funds is the practice standards, as Sylvia's saying, is, you know, creates a kind of standard level of governance. And is there any one of the practice standards that you felt was especially valuable in your thinking? Or, you know, a lot of them are common sense in a way if you're familiar with trust funds, but you know, they really specify very clearly what's expected and what the standards are. In a way, they're kind of best practices, but as Sylvie was saying, it was chosen not to use that term. But any sort of area of the practice standards that you found extremely informative or aspirational?
I think one of the things where we feel, I've been feeling this these 2 years, is environmental safeguards, and these new standards are like a requisite from the different donors, and one of the things we are learning to deal with it, but at the same time we need to help some subdonors. So we give some grants to other organizations, and we have to supervise also their safeguards, because that's the role of a trust fund. No, and in that sense, having these guidelines, what we are looking for is like following this life cycle of not for the trust fund, but for the projects and the organizations that trying to apply this standard for trust funds to the organizations that will receive the money. So we are looking at their stage, their capabilities, and which set of standards you can adopt for them. Because as Amilcar mentioned, I think you too, David, it's not easy to apply all the standards to the different organizations, you know. So environmental and gender safeguards are like a very cornerstone for us, and difficult standard, but the guidelines is helping. And the other one is anti-corruption. So that's also a very needed standard for us, because when donors give money to trust funds, they are giving it in trust, no? And so if you are not able to have a complete set of anti-corruption standards and also follow up what other receiving organizations are doing, it's hard. No, it's quite hard, and your reputation is in that. No. And last, I think something that is also very important is all this communication area, no? Because I think, as Sylvia mentioned, each trust fund is different, no? And for instance, we work at the same time with more or less 10 donors. So if you have to communicate and disseminate all the information, and you have to follow what the donor is asking in each of the parts of the funding. So it's difficult, no? And having this guideline is helping us a lot in that.
Excellent, thank you. Well, I want to open up the floor to questions from the floor. If anyone has some questions they're dying to ask about the practice standards, or just dying to ask our wonderful panel here about their work in trust funds and their trust funds, now's your chance. Just, yeah, great. Just please state your name and then the question. So we'll go there first and then there. Yeah. Oops.
Sorry, I want to speak in Spanish because my English is pretty bad.
No problem.
Es una curiosidad. Me parece que es súper bien tener, digamos, los estándares que permitan tener, digamos, donantes financieros confiables. Sin embargo, entiendo que esto tiene complicaciones y costos altos en
inversión de tiempo, de personal, de desarrollo de los estándares mismos. Y me pregunto si es que ha habido alguna evaluación de cuál es el impacto en términos de conservación, la efectividad en términos de conservación y los costos que significan tener estos fondos confiables, digamos, ¿no? Versus otros aquellos fondos que no tienen tantos requisitos, que tampoco dan una cantidad importante de dinero, pero que tal vez por eso tienen una facilidad mayor de llegar al campo y de traducirse en un resultado efectivo, porque tal vez podría ahí encontrarse un uso mucho más eficiente y eficaz de los recursos que cada vez son menos disponibles.
Okay, maybe you could maybe just summarize the question.
So I think the question is more related if it's cost effective to have organizations that need to fulfill all these standards and at the same time trying to get as much money as you can to the beneficiaries. No? So I think that's a valid question and from my point of view, still unsolved question, because trust is something that you earn and you have to conserve the trust. And in a world where you are the donors are constantly requiring more standards, having their trust requires yourself to start following their path, no? And as Amilcar mentioned in one slide, the amount of resources that you require to intervene, to try to protect our biodiversity and working on climate change and the rest, needs that some organizations go up on that escalier, how do you say, ladder, no? And try to bring these resources. And that's also, I think, the reason why there are not so much trust funds. There are a lot, but it's more or less 1, 2, or 3 per country, no? Because donors see a trust fund as a go-between, as a tool that can help them to allocate more resources to that country, and then these trust funds need to allocate these resources to other organizations. And I think that that's some role that needs to be better communicated, no? And the other thing is the amount of money is large, but not that large, no?
Maybe I wanted to add that part of what Amilcar was saying before about the different stages of the conservation trust fund. So on the first hand, this is something very specific to conservation trust funds, right? But additionally, you have maybe conservation trust funds that have 1 or 2 people in their staff and that are very, very small, but they are also able to participate with these things, and maybe their investment won't be as large. Probably they won't have access to larger funds as well, but they are at least complying with some level in the practice standards and are working towards reaching better quality and better levels. So maybe Profonampe, which is a big fund with with a lot of people, right? There's a lot of people working in Profonampe. There's a lot of funds that like the trust fund is pretty big. Has the possibility to have one person dedicated only to this, but a smaller fund like the Fund of Honduras maybe doesn't have that opportunity, and it's okay. They can still implement the practice standards, and that is part of the beauty of working in a collaborative way, and also working with the people in the field. And the other aspect that I wanted to mention is what Anton also, like, bringing a little bit of what Anton said. He mentioned that conservation trust funds want to offer their beneficiaries also the possibility of improving their risk management in terms of gender, in terms of social, and in terms of environment, right? So it's a way to having the conservation trust fund having their standards trickles down to the beneficiaries in the ground, and that helps them also become better and have better quality, ultimately leading to more funds being able to reach that beneficiary. So I think it's very valuable.
Yes, that was more or less answered. My question was whether having the discipline of incorporating the practice standards in your trust fund, whether that makes your work with others that are implementing the funds available easier.
So I think this is a kind of learning process. No, it's a learning process. For instance, last year we implemented a grant competition, small grants with the Protected Areas Authority, and some of the grantees have taken 3 or 4 months to fulfill the requirements to receive the money. No, and then it's a question mark, because you say, okay, they need the money, they are working with the citoyens, with the people on the ground, but at the same time you have to fulfill your standards, because the donors are looking if you are really implementing or not. If it's not only a manual that you bring up when the donor come and then you set aside and do whatever you want. No, it's hard, really, it's hard, because and also we currently are trying to, we need to do a due diligence of our grantees. That's something new. In the past, the due diligence was to Profonampe. Now we need to do the due diligence to the grantees. So you cannot look at the grantees with the same glasses. You need to have a toolkit where they can fulfill, and that's also applying to the previous question. Some marks are really necessary, and others are good if they can fulfill it. But that's my way of working.
We're running out of time, but Amilcar wanted to say just one thing.
Yes, so in relation to the previous question, maybe something that was not emphasized enough is the long-term perspective of conservation trust funds, because if you compare them with other organizations, they are not just channeling funds from donors and bringing them to the ground, but they are also building funds for the future. So they have this long-term perspective, and that of course has some additional costs perhaps, but also as part of this discussion we had, I remember there was a huge discussion on overhead costs, and conservation trust funds are also trying to minimize those. So becoming more efficient and being really bringing as much of those funds that they're receiving to actual conservation programs. So I just wanted to add that long-term aspect that I think is quite crucial.
I think we're gonna have to stop there, but I really wanted to thank a great panel here. Big round of applause for the wonderful panel. And thank you. And thank you all for joining us. And we have another session coming right up. So. On pooling of conservation trust funds. This one's going to be good.
Meeting you, Anton.
All right.
Yes, if you can, that'd be very nice. We'd be very happy to have you. And I wanted to, I knew Prof. Nampe from